welcome to you all. Thank you very much for joining our Zoom briefing today, which is on the Pope's impending visit to Iraq. It's a 3-day visit. It starts on Friday this week, and we're joined by a panel including Professor Sajjad Rizvi from the University of Exeter, Julia Bicknell from World Watch Monitor, and Christopher Lamb, one of our own journalists, but who works for the tablet from out of the Vatican. And Christopher, perhaps I can start with you to shed some light on this visit, because the Vatican has just held a briefing only a couple of hours ago, so hot off the press. I wonder if you could just tell us what is expected in the visit that when it starts on Friday.
Yes, well, thank you, Ruth, and welcome to everyone. I just had this briefing at the Vatican, and this trip that the Pope is undertaking in quite extraordinary circumstances. It's going to be a chock-a-block visit. He's going to be going to 7 cities in Iraq in under 4 days. He's going to be crisscrossing the country, doing as much as he can. And I've written, and I think this is true. I think it is the riskiest trip that the Pope has taken, because of the impact of COVID, because of the security situation. And this is something that I asked the Vatican spokesman today, is it the riskiest trip of his pontificate? And the response was, I would say it's certainly one of the most interesting. So he's being quite diplomatic there, but there's certainly, from what I understand, been some people in the Vatican who have asked questions about whether it should happen right now, whether it could be postponed. But the Pope is determined to go ahead with the trip. And the Vatican spokesman said today that, the way to read this trip is an act of love by the Pope to a country that has suffered terribly over recent decades. And Francis knows that sometimes the riskiest trips, the ones which have the greatest benefit, and that's something that I've seen when I've travelled with Pope Francis, that it's actually the countries who are suffering the most, who are in the worst situations, where a papal trip can really make a difference, and can make the biggest difference. I remember when the Pope went to Central African Republic in 2015, and it was in the middle of a war zone. That trip really brought the whole country together. I think that's what the Pope and the Vatican will be hoping happens with this trip to Iraq. So there are 3 aims to this trip. The first is to encourage the Christian community in the country, in Iraq. It's a beleaguered community. There was 1.5 million Christians before the 2003 invasion in Iraq, and now it's down to around 300,000. So the Pope wants to encourage those Christians in an ancient church. I mean, the Christian community goes right back to the beginnings, and it's found in the Bible and the Acts of the Apostles. So the Pope wants to encourage the Christians in the country. The second is pursuing interreligious dialogue. The Pope is going to be having an interreligious dialogue meeting in Ur, which is the birthplace of Abraham, the father of the monotheistic faiths. He's going to be meeting Ayatollah al-Sistani, the Shiite leader of Iraq, and a Shiite authority, global Shiite authority. And that's going to be a very significant moment. And this is actually the Pope's first trip to a Shiite majority Muslim country. In the past, he's been to Sunni countries. And the third point is to encounter Iraq itself, a country that has suffered over the years. And the Vatican has been involved in diplomatic efforts in building bridges with Iraq, but also in trying to stop the Iraq war in 2003. John Paul II sent a special envoy to try and bring peace. And the Pope's diplomat in Iraq, the ambassador in Iraq, at the time, stayed put as the bombs fell. His name was Cardinal Filoni, and he is also going to be traveling with Pope Francis on this trip. So the Vatican has, and the Holy See has, a long relationship with Iraq, and this, of course, is the first visit by a pope to Iraq. So it's historic in that sense, and it's also a trip that previous popes have tried to do and failed. John Paul II in 1999 and 2000 wanted to go. The trip was in preparations, but Saddam Hussein pulled the plug on that. So I think there is a sense from Francis of urgency, of trying to get this trip, make this trip a success and make it happen. He has been grounded in the Vatican for the last 15 months. He hasn't traveled since 2019, so this is the first trip since then. And so I think we're going to see, I think, a visit which has incredibly powerful symbols. It's going to send a message, I think, to the world around the fact that religions can come together to bring peace. And I think it's going to send a very powerful message about reconciliation when Francis goes and prays at the churches that were destroyed by ISIS. It's a place called Church Square near Mosul, near the Nineveh Plain. And Francis will be there and pray for all victims of war. And I think those are the moments that we are really going to remember from this trip. And I always think with papal visits, it's not so much the speeches that the Pope gives or the words, it's just the presence of the Pope in these incredibly symbolic places for not just for Christianity, but for all the three monotheistic religions. So he's traveling to an ancient church, but he's also showing that it is not just it's not just about going to see the Christian community, but it's also about promoting a sense of fraternity across religions and a sense of brotherhood. And the motto for the trip is "We are all brothers." So I think it's a trip to watch closely because it's going to have a big impact, I think.
This briefing that you had a couple of hours ago, Christopher, was it for the press corps at the Vatican for journalists? Was that the briefing?
Yes, it was, yes.
What was it raised again, how risky this is to go to Iraq, which is now under curfew, where apparently the cases of COVID are doubling? Was there any further discussion about that today?
Yes, there was, and the Vatican spokesman was pressed twice on that. Why do this now? Why not postpone the trip? And the answer that was given was, well, that the Iraqi authorities are happy for this trip to go ahead. They have put in restrictions for COVID, and they have said in Iraq that they want the trip to go ahead. The church leaders and religious leaders want the trip to go ahead, and so the Pope has said he'll do it. And I think that is the line coming from the Vatican. I mean, I know that there have been disagreements. Some people have said postpone. Some people have said, you can do it later. But the Pope has decided he wants to go ahead with it. Now, he has indicated in the past that if he was to postpone the trip, then it would be because of COVID. He wouldn't want to cause infections. I think there is a risk there that there could be a problem around whether there is transmission, because there's going to be a mass for 10,000 people in Erbil. Apparently all have their designated seats, so there's going to be social distancing, etc. But obviously when the Pope arrives anywhere in any situation, people flock to see him. So it's going to be difficult, I think, to maintain the social distancing. Don't see quite how they're going to do that. But according to the Vatican and also according to the Iraqi authorities, they're happy for this trip to go ahead despite the rising number of COVID cases.
Right. Thanks, Christopher. Obviously, we'll come back to you very shortly. But can I just bring in at this point Professor Sajjad Rizvi from Exeter University? Thank you very much for joining us, Professor. I think it's your first time on these Zooms. And pick up that point that Christopher was talking about there, that the Iraqi government, that the people in political power want him to be there. I wonder if you could just give some kind of comment as to your understanding as to why they think this is so important, please.
I think it's quite clear. It's because of the fact that the Pope is a very significant global figure. They also like the idea of a non-Muslim, and certainly even a non, one could say, Shia figure visiting Iraq, meeting lots of the different communities, so that it can help them promote the idea that Iraq is still a place of multiple confessions and religious communities. And I think it's just generally to counter the sense that Iraq is a dangerous place to be. And the fact that for quite some time now, people, because of COVID, haven't been able to travel to Iraq. So in some ways, it's also, I guess, demonstrating confidence in the way in which the government is dealing with COVID. Although strictly speaking, the figures seem to go contrary to that. As just mentioned, I mean, the figures are rising. And my understanding is Baghdad at the moment is in the midst of a temporary lockdown for most people in Baghdad, although that isn't necessarily the case beyond Baghdad. So I think it's those sort of issues. It's confidence in the country. It's promoting the idea of Iraq as a multi-confessional, multi-religious space. And it's really trying to put Iraq back in a positive sense on the global platform.
Can you explain a little bit more about the visit he's going to make to see the Grand Ayatollah Ali al-Sistani in the south of the country? And just looking him up, he's been recommended for Nobel Peace Prizes. He's been called the most influential figure in post-invasion Iraq. Can you tell us a little bit more about the Grand Ayatollah, the man, and how significant you think this particular visit is?
So in terms of who Sayyid Ali Sistani is, I mean, he's certainly the most important Shia Muslim leader globally, and he has been for a very long time. He in very many ways, he emerged after the war in 2003, 2004. He has a following which is not just restricted to Iraq or even the near vicinity, but also he's the one Shia religious leader who has the largest following across Asia, across communities in the Middle East, across Europe and North America. And he's seen as being someone who provides kind of calm, statesman-like religious leadership, which contrasts to the much more acutely political and activist or engaged leadership, which Sayyid Khamenei, who is the spiritual leader in Iran, provides. So that contrast with Iranian leadership is quite significant. It's significant within Iraq and the region, and it's also significant globally. But I think it's particularly this kind of promotion of him as a leader who reaches out, a leader who is considered to be some sort of protector of different religious communities, particularly of religious minorities in Iraq and in the region, someone who can also reach out to the large Sunni minority in Iraq and the wider region to try and temper sectarian tensions in Iraq and the Gulf. So for all those sort of many reasons, also I guess the most important point politically is that for quite some time he's been very much the figure who provides legitimacy and guarantees the political process in Iraq. So he was the one who was supportive of the writing of the constitution, of the independent, of the interim government, and then of course later of the various elections which have taken place. Of course, there's a wide kind of a question about his relationship with the Shia political parties, but certainly in recent years, you could say that he's tried to act as an independent figure who is not tied to a particular political bloc, and is really just someone who's trying to support the political, the democratic, the accountable process. For example, before lockdown happened, the very clear support that he was providing through his Friday sermons, which are delivered in his name in Karbala, in particular, in the other major shrine city in the south. supporting the demonstrators against the government, against corruption in Baghdad and other places was quite significant. So I think for all those reasons, Sistani is a very, very significant figure. In terms of the actual meeting, I think for Sistani's office, it will be considered to be a very major way of making sure that he remains in sort of the global eye, in the global perspective of, someone who arguably is the most significant Muslim religious leader in the world. I think that there's not very little doubt that that is the case already. His office and the seminary in Najaf, where he's based, which is one of the two major shrine cities, where the shrine of Ali, the cousin of the Prophet, and the first Shia Imam is, they like to sort of portray themselves as the Vatican, the Shia Vatican. So it makes sense for him to be then directly meeting, the head of the better known Vatican. So they see it as kind of a meeting of equals in that sense. And I think alongside that, this idea of actually hosting him in Najaf is quite important. So particularly in the south, in cities which are marked by kind of tribal values, as they are in southern Iraq, and in a place like Najaf, the symbolic significance of actually providing hospitality to the Pope will be seen as something very positive as well.
Thank you very much. We'll come back to you also in a moment. Can I turn to our third panelist, Julia Bicknell from World Watch Monitor? And this is really to sketch in the kind of Christian character of the country. I just wonder from your research, and I should say that your organisation follows the stories of persecuted Christians around the world. So you've spoken to lots of people in Iraq. Just sketch out the Christian makeup of Iraq and its recent history for us.
Well, as Christopher was saying, you've got to remember that after the Second World War, Christians formed about 12% of the population. And then, of course, it came down dramatically particularly after the American invasion or the Allied invasion, I should say, in 2003. And as Christopher again said, the Christians were a real part of the makeup of what they would call the mosaic of religions in Iraq. And again, Christopher pointed out the sort of ancient roots. And I do remember US Vice President Mike Pence told against himself when he went for a visit some years after the invasion, and he was asking Christian families, and when did your family become Christians? And the answer was, well, around 2000 years ago. And he was completely shocked by that. And I think that just shows you how little particularly some of the Western nations really understood. So coming back to your question, there's a whole range. There's obviously the Eastern churches, again, rooting right back to the earliest times in the Bible. Some of them link back through to the language that Jesus spoke, Aramaic, and they have roots in the sort of what they call the Syriac church. About 70% of the Christians in Iraq belong to the Chaldean Catholic Church, probably, and so they're in relationship, in communion with the Roman Catholic Church, but nevertheless they're still distinct. And so I've seen Archbishop Louis Sacco. I've seen him at conferences in Rome talking to the Roman Catholics. But of course, there's also some Protestants. There are pockets of Protestants. We've probably all heard of the Anglican cathedral or church in Baghdad, where the famous Canon Andrew White used to be from the Anglicans. And then, of course, there are also other Protestants as well. Now, the key areas, and this is quite interesting, are mainly much further to the north and the east. So particularly the Nineveh Plain. And there are lots of Christian villages, very predominantly, they were, until a few years ago, very much Christian villages. They, were dominated by churches. That was their tradition. And also the town, city of Erbil, which is in the Kurdish region. If you remember back to your geography and history, the Kurdish region is an autonomous region, but still part of Iraq, so Iraqi Kurdistan, and particularly the town of Erbil, where the Pope will go. There was a whole area called Ankawa in the north of the city, and that was very much a kind of Christian suburb. And that's the area where in 2014, when Islamic State swept into that region, many Christians from those villages fled into Erbil, and there were thousands of Christians came into some of the monasteries and churches, and many of them are still in that area. So they're IDPs, they're internally displaced, and they don't feel comfortable or confident about going back to their villages, because although there's been a massive amount of effort gone into rebuilding, and many houses are reconstructed, for all sorts of reasons, predominantly security, people still don't feel comfortable. And the main reason for that is they say, yes, theoretically Islamic State was chased out, but in practice, many of the mindsets of our neighbours have not changed. And we know, this is what they say, we know that when Islamic State came in, our neighbours were colluding and were telling them where we lived. And particularly that happened, say, in Mosul, which is the major city in that part of the Nineveh area. And so they're saying, well, yes, okay, so the soldiers with the guns have gone, or the militia with the guns have gone, the Islamic State, but how do we know our neighbours? How can we really trust them again? And particularly that was the case when they were chased out of their properties. As you'll remember, they had the N in the Arabic N daubed on their gates of their houses. They're still trying to get those houses back in many cases. So struggling to get through the courts and the legal systems to get their properties back. And so there's a lot of insecurity, there's lack of employment. Fine, many of them say, I can move back. Yes, my house has been repaired and restored, but what's my prospects? What are my prospects for a job? What are the prospects of my children for education? Schools, interestingly, in one of the very Christian villages, a school has been built, but it's all been funded by money from Iran, from the Shiite money. And so they're saying, this wasn't our culture, this wasn't our community as it, before we were chased away, and now we're struggling because we feel we're losing our identity, our language, our traditions. So that's just some of the responses of the Christians that I've heard.
Thank you, Julia. Thank you. And I can see we have Rabee on the call. Rabee, al-Hafidh, you're new to our call. I wonder, perhaps if you could introduce yourself first of all and make some kind of observation as to what Julia's just outlined there. Talking about Mosul, I can see your Mosul Foundation in the background there.
Thank you for allowing this opportunity to participate in this important event. I would love to say that the people of Iraq, the normal people, look at the events in slightly different concepts. Mosul, where I come from, and this applies to the rest of Iraq as well, is multicultural by default. Muslims and Christians in Mosul know how to live in brotherhood. And this is not out of education, but this is way of life. Now, the agony of the people of Mosul, Muslims and Christians, is the control of their life by the militias. That's what interrupted their multiculturalism. Iraq, since 2003, has been governed not by a state, but by non-state actors. So the American invasion opened a new chapter in the Middle East, where non-state actors took over from the state. There's no statehood in Iraq today. There's a parliament, there is president, there is prime minister, but all run by militias. This is a fact which doesn't need proof. Every single person in Iraq, even the uneducated, know that the country are run by militias. Elections are decided by militias. Prime minister is chosen by militias. ministries, departments, police, it's all the economy, all dominated by militias. Borders are controlled by militias, so there's no state. Now the Pope is expected to call for the departure of the militias from Mosul to allow the return of civic administration. Now, multiculturalism in Mosul goes back in history, in centuries in the past, is the earliest prior exercise of multiculturalism on this planet. And this is not one which is policed by the state, it's way of life. So once these militias are out of the city, and once the people are, the experts and the normal people are allowed to run their affairs, multiculturalism will resume. Now the Pope, instead, is visiting the very character whom Iraqis across the spectrum, Muslims, Christians, Shia, Kurds, Arabs, Turkmen, are condemning as the real head of the theocratic regime, which is incompatible to their society. Iraq has always been a secular society. People are conservative, Christians and Muslims. They are mosque goers, church goers, but life is secular, and they coexisted in a beautiful example which is unrivaled anywhere. So this person, the Iraqis now, on the streets of Karbala, of Nasiriyah in the south, where Shia are a majority, he is condemned as the custodian of corruption, political, financial, and sectarian. He is the sponsor of all the governments which came to and ruled Iraq since 2003. He is silent about the financial corruption, a country which is financially riddled. Now, they want, the people of Iraq, Sunnis, Shia, they want the voice of an important global character to be added to their voice. Removing the militias from the life in Iraq is a gateway back to multiculturalism, multi-faith. For these reasons, the Iraqis find the papal visit is on the wrong side of their struggle. And to this end, Mosul Foundation, which I represent, is an NGO, is holding a conference in June titled Protecting and Rebuilding Urban Centers in Post-ISIS Middle East, Mosul as example, in association with CTPSR and Rising and CAFE in Coventry. It's going to cover these concepts and discuss ways of reviving urbanism and reviving multiculturalism and getting the people who fled Iraq, not only Christians, everybody's fleeing Iraq. They are fleeing Turkey and neighboring Turkey and Jordan. They are fleeing in their hundreds of thousands, including Christians. So they're all fleeing. Even Shia are fleeing Iraq because life is not worth living under this theocratic regime, which is headed by Sistani. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Rabee. If I just ask Sajjad to come in, followed by Christopher, if I may. Thanks.
I mean, of course, it's not for me to tell Iraqis what they should and should not think and how they see their country. And unfortunately, there is a widespread held, I would really describe it as a conspiracy theory, that Sistani and his office constitute deep state in Iraq. I mean, you'll find plenty of articles on the internet which say that. I think that's a bit of a problematic position to take because his own position on the militias is difficult. I mean, he doesn't have a militia of his own, any significant militia of his own. People for a number of years have been saying, well, why doesn't he come out explicitly condemn the militias, ask for their disarmament? Well, he has asked for the disarmament of the militias and the normalization, but it hasn't happened. And that's partly because he doesn't have the political power to effect that. At the end of the day, the political power in Iraq doesn't lie with this old chap in a side street in Najaf. It lies with those who actually wield political power, either behind a gun or to those who actually are handing out the jobs and the ministries in Baghdad. So, it's not really for me to kind of defend, say, Sistani. I mean, he has his own people who can do that. But I think that's a slightly problematic way of looking at this. I don't think anyone really believes that Iraq is run from this small house in Najaf. Sistani is not Khomeini. This whole idea that he might be Khomeini or even like Khamenei in Iran doesn't actually make any sense at all. And again, as I said, if you look at the statements which have come out from his office on corruption, on the political process, especially since about 2014, that sort of vision just does not hold true. But I'm sure there are Iraqis who see things in different ways. And as I said, it's not really for me to tell Iraqis what they should and should not believe in this process. And I actually agree. Iraq is a multicultural place. It has been always. But again, we should be slightly careful about falling into this rather rosy kind of picture of how things were before 2003. They were not ideal even before 2003. You have to go back a long way to find a really properly plural Iraq. Some people have nostalgia for the monarchy, some people have nostalgia for pre-68, etc. But there've always been kind of issues in modern Iraq, and it wouldn't be sensible to kind of brush those aside.
Thank you. Can I go to Christopher Lamb next and then Edwin Shuker afterwards? But Christopher, could you pick up what Rabee was saying there about turning to a secular society and whether this visit will do any good?
Yes, I mean, as Rabee hinted at, the Pope is likely to seek to promote the role of civic society in the rebuilding of Iraq and in Iraq as a democratic, multicultural state. And I don't think you will find the Pope giving any support to some kind of theocracy in Iraq. It's a very clear position of the Catholic Church since the Second Vatican Council of religious freedom and a separation of church and state. And the Vatican has recently been active or the Pope has been active in calling for support of the pro-democracy supporters in Myanmar, for example. So I think when the Pope goes to Iraq, you can expect his message to the secular leaders to be one of pro-democracy, for bringing a wide group into as wide a group as possible into rejuvenating Iraq, and also though seeing that religious believers, those of religious faith, are part of that, and you can't rebuild Iraq or any society unless you also pay attention to religion. And I think that's what the Pope will seek to show. And I think the meeting with al-Sistani is one that is going to send a message to the world about interreligious cooperation, about religious leaders coming together to both show that religion is not the problem for society, but actually part of the solution for building a healthy society. And we don't know yet if al-Sistani and the Pope will sign any document or release any agreed text, but that will be worth looking out for. There was some rumor that that al-Sistani would sign the human fraternity document that was produced by the Pope and the Grand Imam of al-Azhar in Abu Dhabi, of course, the Grand Imam being the Sunni leader, Sunni authority. We don't know if that's going to happen. It may not. Maybe that may be a bridge too far. But I think that meeting between the Pope and al-Sistani will be very, very important. So I think that will be how the Pope will address those issues.
Thank you. Bring in Edwin Shuker at this point. Edwin, you're title Vice President of the Board of Deputies of British Jews. Tell us what we're missing.
Okay, thank you very much for allowing me to speak. I was born in Baghdad, Iraq in 1955. I grew up there, part of the remnants of a glorious Jewish community that has settled in that part of the world since 586 before Common Era. We're talking about 2,606 years. We're talking about the actual Jewish religion as we know it today was formed in that area and not in Israel. We're talking about a land which still today got 6 biblical prophets in Iraq, which are not, they are all senior prophets from the Bible. We are not in Israel, but they are actually in Iraq. Since 1951, successive governments pursued a systematic ethnic cleansing of every Jew from that land, including myself and my family. We are talking about our lives turned, myself personally, as of 1963, was turned into hell, including public hangings of 10 Jews in 1969 in the public square of Saht al-Tahrir in Iraq, to such an extent that we were forced to escape in 1971 through the Kurdish mountains into Iran with just our clothes on. Since 2003, I have been going to Iraq, to Baghdad, whenever it's possible, certainly every year in the last few years, just to make sure that we don't, that our story and our history is not totally wiped out, the Iraq history. And as what I mentioned in my chat thing is today, I still haven't heard the word Jew mentioned as part of the visit or as part of anyone's narrative about the religious harmony in Iraq. Now, just to say that I personally requested from the Vatican embassy in Iraq to include a delegation from Jews of Iraqi origin like myself, who wish to remain Iraqis, who wish to be identified, who wish to claim back our prophets, our shrines, our cemeteries, not to mention the properties and everything else that was taken away from us. I believe that the Vatican embassy did suggest that to the Iraqi authorities to include a delegation, but it was refused. And the excuse is we do not want anyone who is not an Iraqi national. Of course, they have taken the nationality of every Jew, except today there's only 4 recognizable Jews, just 4 elderly Jews with Iraqi nationality in Iraq, out of what used to be in the turn of the 20th century, 40% of Baghdad was Jewish, and 150,000 Jews lived in Iraq in 1950. We wanted the visit of the Pope to actually highlight this story. We wanted to stand with him and pray with him in Ur, where Abraham was born. We wanted that to be known that we who have always been loyal to that land and the people of that land have lost everything in that land, including the prophets. And I want to tell you the last thing I want to say, since 2003, the real destruction and plundering of Jewish properties, including the prophets, including, for example, the prophet Ezekiel, who is only about 20 miles from Najaf, who stayed there, and we went there for prayers twice a year. Up to 2003, he was standing that shrine. And today it was taken by the Shiite of Najaf and made into 40 shops, a whole market which led to that shrine has been totally wiped off and taken. Instead, a huge mosque was built called al-Nukhail Mosque, which now has a tiny little room inside the mosque, which got the little tomb of the prophet Ezekiel, but the entire site has become now an Islamic shrine, which was a cultural crime. But no one mentions that, and we wanted that to be highlighted. And I'm glad you allowed me the few minutes to say that in a public place. Thank you.
Thank you, Edwin. And I'd just like to turn to Christopher Lamb first on this. Has that story ever been raised in any of the briefings that you've been in as this trip has been planned and discussed?
Yes. Well, it was asked today actually about the involvement of Jewish people in the interreligious dialogue meeting that's happening in Ur, and there will be, according to the Vatican, representatives of the Jewish community, Jewish people at the interfaith gathering in Ur. That's what we were told. So I don't know if there will be Jewish leaders or rabbis alongside the other leaders, but I do know that there will be. Well, we were told that there will be Jewish people at the interfaith gathering in Ur.
Thanks, Chris. I mean, everyone has mentioned, or lots of people have mentioned, this interreligious dialogue that's going on in Iraq. It's extensive and widespread. I just wonder if any of our panelists can just explain what's going on. Is there interreligious dialogue in every town and city, a national level? Does it include everybody? Does it exclude people? I mean, what's going on? Does anyone know?
I would personally be very skeptical of the possibilities. There are sometimes bilateral relations with between religious leaders, but for it to actually trickle down, I think that has been an issue. Even the way in which IDPs have been dealt with across the country, there are of course IDPs who are Christian in the South as well. I mean, I'm kind of cynical about this. I think a lot of interfaith dialogue in many contexts tends to be just with the leaders and the elites and does not necessarily trickle down into actual relations on the ground. And that's true of Iraq as it is in many parts of the Middle East, as it is arguably even in Britain and Europe and many other places as well. I hate to have to be cynical about this, but I think that's just the reality on the ground. A lot of it is very much, full opportunities and being seen to be reaching out to the other and not necessarily embracing. I think there are genuine cases of people really opening up their houses and so forth, especially to IDPs, but for this to be systematic modes of society and the way in which local government, etc. works, I really haven't seen that at all. And even like organizations which I think are very good on this, such as the Salam Foundation, which is run by Sayyid Hussein al-Sadr and Gardemia in Baghdad. He's very much kind of a one-man show who tries to reach out to different religious communities, to cultural communities, tries to insist that Baghdad is still a city of different religions, but also of culture, of music, of poetry. He's very much someone who's kind of going against the wider trend within the state and certainly within the city.
Thank you.
Sorry to be so negative about this, but unfortunately, I think that's just reality.
I was going to say that I am aware that, particularly in Mosul, that local young people, particularly Muslims, were helping to rebuild some of the churches, and I've seen, they've been featured in different newspapers. I remember the Independent, the Guardian. But the reality is that and I'd love to know what our friend from Mosul says now, but I was, in preparation for today, I was questioning how many Christians have gone back to Mosul, given that, I was always searching for a figure of how many Christians were there when Islamic State came in, because it's fair to say a lot of the Christians had already left Mosul because of the climate of sort of intimidation before Islamic State moved in. And I was told, let's say roughly there were 30 to 40,000 in Mosul before Islamic State. Now I'm told there are somewhere between maybe 50 and 75, maybe less, in the whole city. Now, if you've got that tiny minority, it's going to be quite difficult to have meaningful connection, because exactly as Sajjad Rizvi says, if the whole structures of local government, local authority, local councils do not enable those kind of really minority voices to be heard or meaningfully involved in dialogue and decision making and elections and all those kind of things, then it's very hard to feel that you're getting anywhere with so-called interreligious dialogue.
Thank you, Julia. Rabee, do you want to come back?
Thank you. Now, I think the question which needs to be asked is how many people are going back to Mosul, including Christians. How many Muslims are going back to Mosul? There are in there hundreds of thousands in Turkey, and they're not going back to Mosul because it's unsafe and there's no prospect, no future, no education, no services, no security, including Christians. This is, I think, in my view, the right way of asking the question. Now, without tackling the issue of urbanism and civic society, I think we're talking about, I mean, there is a phenomena of now the people are Mosul are frustrated with. They are seeing grand building being rebuilt by UNESCO, mosques, churches, but the society is not there. What the people want is their life back. The people of Mosul, the Muslims of Mosul, they say, is the rebuilding of the Grand Mosque, Al-Nouri Mosque, is a priority over our life and our security? No, it isn't. Is the building of Al-Sa'a Church in Mosul, which is the one of the main landmark in Mosul, is a priority? No, it isn't. But priority is going towards that direction. Visits of global characters are focusing on these things, and the life of the people, the civic life, the urban life is not there. Election, which election? Who is arranging the election? Now in Mosul, a new militia has just arrived in Mosul a few weeks ago to oversee the election and to buy people, to buy voices, to bribe, to threaten. The people of Mosul want, and of Iraq, wants non-state actors to be out of the scene and the state back. A figure like the Pope needs to speak about this, about the very root of the problem. Now, what the Pope is missing the very reason as why the multiculturalism and multi-faith life has been disrupted in Iraq, which is urbanism, which is the state. Iraq has to be put on some sort of supervision, international, to restore the society, the urban centers. Mosul, Aleppo, those cities were actually torches of civilization. They used to export brains, doctors, engineers to the West. Hardly there is a hospital in England and in the West without an engineer or a doctor from these cities. Unfortunately, now we're exporting uneducated people and extreme people. So urbanism must be tackled, and all these issues, and I would call them sad issues. Just one final word, I would say to our friend Julia here, please, unfortunately, the social media, the Mosul social media is all in Arabic. But if you go there and you'll find multi-faith, multiculturalism, brotherhood is still exercised by Muslims and Christians, and they're recalling the the good old days, and they're looking forward to getting them back. It's in their roots, in their veins, in their genes, multiculturalism in Mosul is.
Thank you, Rabee. I wonder if we could just go around our three panelists and just ask you by way of conclusion, if there was one thing that you wish or expect to come out of this visit, what would it be?
I think for me, it's about reminding the world what is happening in Iraq, and particularly, it has gone off the radar. There are all sorts of other crises that have come up, and coronavirus has obviously hit everybody, and we've all become far too preoccupied, and we've pretty much forgotten, I would argue, largely what is going on in this part of the world. And I do think all the sort of issues that we've talked about, they do need the world to be aware and to try to come together and seek some of the solutions we've been trying to talk about. So that for me is the key thing, putting it back on the map.
You know, any kind of papal state visit has its restrictions, depending on which country it is and the requirements of the government. The government obviously wants certain things out of this. But I think what would be good is if it wasn't just about a set of photo opportunities with the major leaders, with sort of figures who, you know, to a large extent, they'll kind of get on and you know, probably say the right sort of things to each other and even, you know, issue the right sort of communiques. But I think it would be really good, you know, as Rabee said as well, it would be wonderful if the Pope actually met some of the communities on the ground who are working together, you know, actually empowered them by recognizing them as well. I don't think that's going to happen in most cases, but it would actually be good if there was some recognition of actual projects on the ground so that one can show there is an attempt by Iraqi civil society, which hasn't disappeared. I mean, it's still there. We see that in the demonstrations, which have been ongoing for months and months, to see that there is hope in that process.
Okay. Well, I think two things. First is that the visit will make life easier for Christians and other minorities in Iraq, and maybe encourage Christians to return. And the second, I think, is to have, just follow up from what others have said, not just a photo opportunity, but to actually, when he meets with al-Sistani, for that to start something more concrete with Sunni leaders. The Pope has a very active dialogue. There's a lot of work going on, and I think if he can start something with al-Sistani and the Shia Muslim community and Muslim leaders, if he can start something concrete there in terms of working together, then I think that will be a very successful outcome of the visit.
Thank you. Well, thank you all very much indeed for joining us today, especially our panelists, and Edwin for your comments as well. We'll be back next week with another Zoom on Tuesday at 12 noon. Stay safe, everyone. Bye.